Right now, as you listen to these words, something else is happening inside your mind. There is a voice. It is commenting. It is evaluating. It might be saying, "This sounds interesting," or it might be saying, "I wonder where this is going." It might be planning what you will do after this, or replaying something that happened earlier today. You did not ask it to speak. You did not press a button or flip a switch. It simply started, the way it always starts, the way it has been starting for as long as you can remember. That voice has been with you since childhood. It was there when you woke up this morning. It was there when you fell asleep last night, or more accurately, it was there keeping you awake when you wanted to fall asleep. It narrates your life. It judges other people. It judges you. It rehearses conversations that have not happened yet and replays conversations that happened years ago. It worries. It fantasizes. It plans. It regrets. And most remarkably, most people have never stopped to ask a very simple but very important question. If that voice is talking, who is listening? This is not a trick question. It is not a riddle designed to confuse you. It is an observation that, once you truly absorb it, has the power to fundamentally change how you relate to your own mind. Because if there is a voice speaking inside your head, and there is also an awareness that can hear that voice, then you and the voice are not the same thing. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who is aware of your thoughts. And that distinction, which sounds so simple it might seem trivial, is one of the most consequential realizations a human being can have. Most people go through their entire lives without making this distinction. They assume that every thought that arises in their mind is theirs, is them, is true, is important, and must be acted upon. A thought appears that says, "You are not good enough," and they believe it. A thought appears that says, "This will never work out," and they feel defeated. A thought appears that says, "That person does not like you," and they withdraw. The thought speaks, and they obey. Not because they consciously decided to obey, but because it never occurred to them that they had a choice. They never realized there was a space between the thought and the response. They never realized that the thought could be observed rather than obeyed. What you are about to explore over the next 2 hours is something that has been understood in various forms for thousands of years, but remains, for most people, almost entirely unknown in practice. It is not complicated. It does not require special equipment or unusual ability. It does not involve manipulating others or suppressing your own experience. It is, in its essence, extraordinarily simple, and yet it is so rarely practiced that it might as well be forbidden. Not because anyone has banned it, but because the mind itself resists it. Because the automatic, reactive patterns of thought that govern most people's lives do not want to be seen. They operate best in the dark, when no one is watching, and the moment you begin to watch them, their power begins to change. The technique is observation. Pure, deliberate, calm observation of your own thoughts. Not fighting them, not suppressing them, not analyzing them endlessly, simply noticing them, watching them arise, watching them linger, watching them pass, and in that watching, discovering something remarkable, that you do not have to do what they say, that a thought can appear in your mind, and you can let it be there without it controlling what you feel, what you decide, or what you do. This is not about becoming empty or blank or emotionless. It is about becoming free, free from the tyranny of automatic reaction, free from the assumption that every thought deserves your allegiance. Free to choose, consciously and deliberately, how you want to respond to what life places in front of you. Let us begin by looking at something most people have never examined closely. Let us look at what is actually happening when you believe you are in control of your mind. If you asked most people whether they control their own thoughts, they would say yes, without hesitation. Of course I control my thoughts, they would say. I am the one thinking them. But if you pressed a little further, if you asked them to simply stop thinking for 60 seconds, to produce complete inner silence with no thoughts at all, they would quickly discover something uncomfortable. They cannot do it. Thoughts arise on their own. They appear unbidden, uninvited, and often unwanted. You can be sitting in a perfectly calm environment with nothing demanding your attention, and your mind will generate thought after thought after thought, many of them repetitive, many of them negative, many of them entirely disconnected from anything happening in the present moment. This is not a sign of disorder. This is the normal, default operation of the human mind. Cognitive scientists estimate that the average person has tens of thousands of thoughts per day. The vast majority of these thoughts are not consciously chosen. They are produced by habitual patterns, by emotional associations, by memories, by fears, by the brain's relentless effort to predict, prepare, and protect. And because these thoughts arise automatically, they create automatic responses. A thought about a past failure triggers a feeling of shame. A thought about an upcoming deadline triggers a wave of anxiety. A thought about something someone said triggers irritation or self-doubt. The thought appears, the emotion follows, and the behavior emerges, all in a chain that happens so quickly and so seamlessly that the person experiencing it rarely notices the individual links. They simply feel as though they are reacting to reality. But they are not reacting to reality. They are reacting to their thoughts about reality. And those thoughts, more often than people realize, are distorted, incomplete, or entirely fabricated. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. You send a message to a friend, and they do not respond for several hours. Your mind generates a thought, they are ignoring me. That thought triggers a feeling, perhaps hurt, perhaps annoyance, perhaps a subtle sense of rejection. That feeling influences your behavior. Maybe you send a follow-up message with a slightly sharper tone. Maybe you withdraw and decide not to reach out again. Maybe you spend the next hour ruminating about whether you did something wrong. All of this, the emotion, the behavior, the rumination, was set in motion by a single thought. A thought that you did not choose, that you did not verify, and that may have been completely wrong. Your friend might have been in a meeting. They might have been driving. They might have seen the message and intended to respond when they had time to write something thoughtful. But your mind did not wait for that information. It generated a story, and you believed it. This is what automatic thinking looks like, and it is happening all the time, in ways both small and large, shaping your emotional life, your relationships, your decisions, and your sense of who you are. There is a particular quality of automatic thinking that makes it especially powerful, and that is its invisibility. You do not experience your thoughts as separate from yourself. You experience them as yourself. When a thought says, "I am not good enough," you do not hear it as a sentence produced by neural activity in your brain. You hear it as the truth about who you are. When a thought says this situation is hopeless, you do not evaluate it as one possible interpretation among many. You feel it as a fact. The thought and your identity merge so completely that questioning the thought feels like questioning your own existence. This is why people cling to negative beliefs about themselves, even when presented with evidence to the contrary. The belief does not feel like a belief. It feels like who they are. This fusion between self and thought is the root of most psychological suffering. It is what makes anxiety so debilitating, because the anxious thoughts do not feel like thoughts. They feel like accurate predictions of the future. It is what makes depression so persistent, because the depressive thoughts do not feel like distortions. They feel like the cold, honest truth. It is what makes anger so consuming, because the angry thoughts do not feel like interpretations. They feel like justified responses to real offenses. In each case, the person is not choosing to be anxious, depressed, or angry. They are being carried along by thoughts they never examined, never questioned, and never realized they could step back from. The pattern is remarkably consistent across people and situations. A triggering event occurs, something external like a comment, a setback, or a change, or something internal like a memory or a physical sensation. The mind generates a thought about the event, an interpretation, a judgment, a prediction. That thought generates an emotion. The emotion generates an impulse to act. And the action generates consequences that often reinforce the original thought, creating a loop that can cycle endlessly without conscious intervention. A person who thinks I always fail approaches a new challenge with hesitation and half-effort, which increases the likelihood of failure, which reinforces the thought that they always fail. A person who thinks people cannot be trusted interprets ambiguous social signals as evidence of betrayal, which leads them to withdraw, which damages their relationships, which reinforces the thought that people cannot be trusted. The loop sustains itself because the person inside it never steps outside it long enough to see the mechanism at work. And this is where the profound simplicity of observation becomes clear. Because the moment you step back and watch the thought, really watch it without getting swept into the current of reaction, the loop is interrupted. The thought still appears, the emotion may still stir, but there is a pause, a gap, a space where for perhaps the first time you can see the thought as a thought rather than as reality itself. And in that space, something extraordinary happens. You realize you have a choice. You can follow the thought, as you have always done, or you can let it be. You can watch it the way you would watch a cloud passing across the sky, present, visible, real in its own way, but not something you need to chase, grab, or obey. This is the foundation of what we are exploring together. Not the suppression of thought, not the forced replacement of negative thoughts with positive ones, but the development of a capacity that most people have never cultivated, the ability to be aware of your own thinking without being enslaved by it. Let us now look at this capacity more closely and understand exactly how it works. The idea of observing your thoughts without reacting to them sounds, on the surface, almost too simple to be meaningful, and yet it is one of the most difficult things a human being can learn to do. Not because it is complex, but because it runs directly against the grain of how the mind normally operates. The mind is built to think and to react. Stimulus, interpretation, response. That is the fundamental sequence that has kept human beings alive for hundreds of thousands of years. When your ancestors heard a sound in the bushes, they did not pause to observe their thoughts about the sound. They reacted. They ran. They froze. They prepared to fight. The ones who paused too long were the ones who did not survive. So your brain, The brain you inherited from those survivors is wired for speed. It is wired to collapse the space between thought and action as tightly as possible. And in situations of genuine physical danger, this is exactly what you want. But in the complex, nuanced, socially intricate world you actually live in, this speed is often your greatest liability. When someone criticizes you in a meeting, and your face flushes, and your jaw clenches, and you fire back with a sharp response before you have even fully processed what was said, that is your brain's ancient wiring at work. When you receive an ambiguous email, and your mind immediately constructs the worst possible interpretation, and you spend the next 2 hours stewing in resentment. That is the same wiring. When you lie awake at 3 in the morning, gripped by a fear about the future that you cannot reason with, that is the wiring running unchecked, doing what it was designed to do, protecting you from threats, but doing it in a context where the threats are mostly imaginary and the protection is making everything worse. The practice of observation without reaction does not try to override this wiring. That would be futile. You cannot simply decide to stop having automatic thoughts, any more than you can decide to stop having a heartbeat. What you can do is develop the capacity to notice the thoughts as they arise and to create a deliberate pause before responding to them. This pause is not passive. It is not the absence of action. It is, in fact, one of the most active and demanding things you can do with your mind. It requires you to hold two things simultaneously, the thought itself and your awareness of the thought. It requires you to be, in a sense, in two places at once, both the thinker and the witness of the thinking. When you first attempt this, you will notice something humbling. Your attention slips almost immediately. You set out to observe your thoughts, and within seconds you are lost in one. You are no longer watching the thought. You are inside it, carried along by its momentum, feeling its emotions, following its logic, reacting to its conclusions. And then, at some point, you realize what has happened. You wake up from the thought, as if from a brief dream, and you are back in the position of the observer. This moment of waking up, this moment of noticing that you were lost in a thought, and are now aware again, is not a failure. It is the practice itself. Every time you notice that you have been carried away, and you return to the position of the observer, you are strengthening the capacity for awareness. You are building the mental muscle that makes the pause possible. Over time, with repetition, something begins to shift. The moments of awareness become more frequent. The periods of being lost in thought become shorter. You begin to catch thoughts earlier in their development, before they have fully captured your attention and triggered a cascade of emotion and reaction. You start to notice the thought as it forms, almost like seeing the first frame of a movie before the rest of the film plays out. And in that early noticing, you gain something invaluable. You gain the ability to choose, to decide whether this thought is worth following, whether the emotion it is triggering is proportional to the situation, and whether the action it is urging you toward is one that serves your actual goals and values. This is not about becoming detached from life. It is not about becoming a passive, emotionless observer who watches everything from a distance. It is about becoming a more skillful participant. When you can see your thoughts clearly, you can use them more effectively. You can recognize which thoughts are helpful and engage with them. You can recognize which thoughts are distorted and let them pass. You can notice when your mind is telling you a story that is not supported by evidence and choose not to build your emotional life on that story. You can notice when an old pattern is being activated, a pattern of self-doubt or defensiveness or avoidance, and choose to respond differently this time. The power of this practice lies not in any single moment of observation, but in its cumulative effect. Each time you observe a thought without reacting, you weaken the automatic link between that thought and the habitual response it normally triggers. Each time you create a pause, you expand the space in which conscious choice can operate. And each time you choose a response that is guided by awareness rather than driven by reflex, you lay down a new neural pathway, a pathway that makes aware response more likely in the future and automatic reaction less likely. This is not a quick fix. It is not a technique that produces instant transformation. It is a gradual, steady deepening of your relationship with your own mind. But it is also not as slow or as difficult as it might seem. Many people who begin this practice report noticeable changes within days or weeks. Not dramatic life-altering changes, but subtle shifts. They notice that they are less reactive in conversations. They notice that they recover more quickly from stressful events. They notice that the gap between stimulus and response has widened just enough to allow a different kind of action. And these small shifts, compounded over time, lead to genuinely different outcomes. To understand what this looks like in practice, and what it looks like when it is absent, let me tell you about someone who learned this the hard way. There was a man named Julian who, by most external measures, had built a successful life. He was 41, a senior project manager at a technology company, married with 2 children, living in a house he had worked hard to afford. But beneath the surface of this apparent success, something was quietly unraveling, and it started, as these things often do, with a single thought. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. Julian was in a meeting with his team and their division head, presenting a project timeline he had spent weeks developing. The presentation was going well until the division head interrupted him mid-sentence and said, in front of the entire team, that the timeline was unrealistic and needed to be reworked. The comment was brief. It was delivered in a matter of fact tone. It was, by any objective measure, a normal piece of workplace feedback. But that is not how Julian experienced it. In the moment the words were spoken, a thought flashed through Julian's mind, so quickly he barely registered it as a thought. It felt more like a fact, a sudden revelation of truth. The thought was, "He does not respect me." That thought was immediately followed by another. "Everyone in this room just saw me get shut down." And another, "They probably agree with him." And another, "I am losing my standing here." None of these thoughts were verified. None of them were examined. They arrived and were accepted instantly, as though they were dispatches from an infallible source, and the emotions that followed were equally immediate. Julian felt a flush of humiliation, then a surge of anger, then a deep, cold anxiety that settled in his stomach. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the edge of the table. For the rest of the meeting, he barely spoke. When he did speak, his voice had a clipped, defensive quality that he was only vaguely aware of. He left the meeting feeling diminished and furious, though he could not have articulated exactly why the intensity of his response was so disproportionate to what had actually happened. Over the next several days, Julian replayed the moment obsessively. He imagined what he should have said. He rehearsed comebacks and counter-arguments. He analyzed the division head's tone, facial expression, and word choice, looking for evidence of disrespect. He found it, or rather, his mind manufactured it, because a mind looking for evidence of a pre-existing belief will always find what it is looking for. He began to notice every ambiguous signal from the division head as confirmation of his theory. A brief email without pleasantries became proof of contempt. A meeting rescheduled without explanation became proof of marginalization. A hallway interaction that felt slightly cool became proof that Julian was being pushed out. The stress began to leak into other areas of his life. He was short-tempered with his wife. He was distracted when his children tried to talk to him. He slept poorly, waking at 4 in the morning with his mind already racing through worst-case scenarios. He began to dread going to work. Not because anything objectively terrible was happening, but because his mind had constructed a narrative in which he was under siege, and that narrative had become more real to him than the actual events of his day. What Julian did not see, what he could not see from inside the storm of his own thinking, was that the entire experience was being driven not by what was happening, but by what he was thinking about what was happening. The division head's comment, the actual words spoken in the actual meeting, occupied perhaps 15 seconds of his life. But Julian's thoughts about that comment occupied weeks. And those thoughts were not passive. They were active architects of his emotional life. They selected what he noticed, filtered what he remembered, shaped what he expected, and determined how he behaved. They turned a routine piece of feedback into a personal crisis, not because the feedback warranted that response, but because Julian's automatic thinking patterns he had never observed or questioned, amplified the event beyond all proportion. The specific patterns at work in Julian's mind were not unique to him. They are patterns that operate in millions of people every day. The first was personalization, the tendency to interpret events as being specifically about you when they may not be. The division head was not making a statement about Julian's worth as a person. He was making a judgment about a timeline. But Julian's mind collapsed the distance between the timeline and his identity, turning a critique of the work into a critique of the worker. The second pattern was mind reading, the assumption that you know what other people are thinking. Julian believed he knew that his colleagues had lost respect for him, that the division head viewed him with contempt, that everyone was silently judging him. But he had no actual evidence for any of this. He had only the stories his mind was generating. The third pattern was catastrophizing, the tendency to project current discomfort into a devastating future. Julian was not just thinking about what had happened. He was thinking about what it meant, where it was leading, how it would end. And those projections, untethered from evidence, spiraled into visions of career collapse and professional humiliation. All of this happened automatically. Julian did not sit down and consciously decide to personalize the feedback, read his colleagues' minds, or catastrophize about his future. These patterns ran on their own, below the level of his conscious awareness, shaping his experience without his knowledge or consent. And because he was not aware of them, he had no way to interrupt them. He was, in the most literal sense, being controlled by thoughts he did not know he was having. This is what happens when there is no space between thought and reaction. The thought appears and is immediately accepted as truth. The emotion follows and is immediately acted upon. And the resulting behavior generates consequences that reinforce the original thought, locking the person deeper into a cycle they cannot see. Julian's story does not end here. We will return to him. But first, let us explore the mechanism that could have changed everything for him much sooner, the deliberate creation of space between what you think and what you do. There is a concept that, once understood, changes the way you experience nearly every moment of your life. It is the concept of the gap. The gap is the space between a thought arising in your mind and your response to that thought. For most people, most of the time, this gap does not functionally exist. The thought appears, and the response follows so quickly that they seem like a single event. You think something, you feel something, you do something, and the entire sequence feels unified, inevitable, and automatic, but the gap is always there. It is just very, very small. And the practice we are exploring is, in its essence, the practice of widening that gap. When the gap is narrow, you are reactive. Your thoughts determine your emotions, and your emotions determine your actions, with almost no intervention from your conscious, deliberate mind. When the gap is wide, you are responsive. Your thoughts still arise, your emotions still stir, but there is a moment, a beat, a breath, in which you can observe what is happening and choose how to proceed. The difference between reactive and responsive may seem subtle, but its consequences are enormous. Reactive people are at the mercy of their internal weather. They are calm when their thoughts are calm and turbulent when their thoughts are turbulent. Responsive people are not immune to internal weather, but they are not controlled by it. They can experience a storm of thinking without being swept away. The first step in widening the gap is simply noticing that the gap exists. This is harder than it sounds, because the mind is very good at creating the illusion of seamless, inevitable reaction. When someone says something that triggers anger, the experience feels like a straight line. They said something offensive. Therefore, I am angry. But there is actually a hidden step in the middle. They said something. I interpreted it as offensive. Therefore, I am angry. The interpretation is the thought, and the thought is where the gap exists. If you can notice the interpretation, if you can catch the thought before it triggers the full emotional response, you have found the gap. You have created a moment of awareness in which a different response becomes possible. One of the most effective ways to widen the gap is through the simple practice of labeling. When you notice a thought, particularly a charged one, you label it. Not out loud, necessarily, but internally. You say to yourself, that is a thought about being rejected, or that is a thought about failure, or there is the worry about money again. This labeling may seem trivial, but it does something important. It shifts you from being inside the thought to being alongside the thought. It introduces a separation between you and the mental event. You are no longer the anger. You are a person noticing that anger has arisen. You are no longer the anxiety. You are a person observing that an anxious thought has appeared. This shift in perspective is small, but its effects are significant. Research in neuroscience has shown that the simple act of labeling an emotion or a thought reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, and increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain's center for reasoning and regulation. In other words, labeling does not just feel helpful. It literally changes the pattern of activation in your brain, reducing the intensity of the emotional reaction and increasing your capacity for thoughtful response. This is not a mystical claim. It is a measurable neurological effect that has been demonstrated repeatedly in controlled studies. Another way to widen the gap is through deliberate delay. When you feel a strong impulse to react, Whether it is to fire off an angry email, to make a cutting remark, to withdraw from a situation, or to make a major decision in a moment of high emotion, you pause. You do not suppress the impulse. You simply delay acting on it. You give yourself time. The amount of time does not need to be long. Even a few seconds can make a difference. Even one conscious breath between the impulse and the action can be enough to shift from reactive to responsive. This delay is not about being slow or indecisive. It is about being strategic. It is about recognizing that the first response your mind generates is often the automatic one, the one produced by old patterns, by fear, by habit, and that a better response is usually available if you give yourself a moment to find it. Some of the most damaging words ever spoken were spoken in the first 2 seconds after a triggering event. Some of the most regrettable decisions were made in the heat of an emotional moment that, in retrospect, called for pause rather than action. There is also a deeper dimension to widening the gap, and it has to do with questioning the authority of your own thoughts. Most people treat their thoughts as trustworthy reporters of reality. If the thought says this is terrible, they believe it is terrible. If the thought says I cannot handle this, they believe they cannot handle it. But thoughts are not reporters. They are interpreters. They take raw data from your experience and run it through filters of memory, expectation, mood, and habit. The output is not reality. It is a version of reality, shaped by the particular filters that were active at the time. When you are tired, the same situation looks more threatening. When you are anxious, the same comment sounds more hostile. When you are insecure, the same silence feels more loaded. The situation has not changed, but your interpretation of it has. And if you do not recognize that your interpretation is just one of many possible interpretations, you will mistake it for the truth and react accordingly. Widening the gap means developing the habit of asking a simple question. When a strong thought arises, is this thought accurate, or is it a story my mind is telling me? Not every thought needs to be questioned. Routine thoughts, practical thoughts, thoughts that are clearly grounded in observable reality, these can be engaged with straightforwardly. But charged thoughts, thoughts that carry strong emotion, thoughts that trigger impulsive behavior, thoughts that seem to confirm your worst fears, these are the thoughts that deserve a second look. And the simple act of looking, of holding the thought up to the light and examining it rather than swallowing it whole, is often enough to reveal its distortions. You do not need to become a philosopher or a meditation master to do this. You simply need to develop the habit of noticing the thought, noticing the emotion, noticing the impulse, and inserting, wherever possible, a moment of conscious awareness between what arises in your mind and what you do about it. That moment is the gap, and that gap is where your freedom lies. One of the most important things to understand about the relationship between thoughts and emotions is that the relationship is not what most people assume it to be. Most people believe that emotions are caused by events. Something happens, and then they feel a certain way. But this model, however intuitive it may seem, is incomplete. Emotions are not caused by events directly. They are caused by the interpretation of events. The thought comes first, and the emotion follows. This does not mean that emotions are not real. They are powerfully, undeniably real. But it means that the pathway to the emotion runs through the mind's interpretation of the situation. And if you can observe that interpretation, you can influence the emotion that follows. Consider two people who are both stuck in traffic. One thinks, "This always happens to me. I am going to be late. This is going to ruin my whole day." That person experiences frustration, anxiety, and helplessness. The other thinks, "Well, there is nothing I can do about this. I will use the time to listen to something or just sit quietly." That person experiences mild inconvenience, perhaps even a moment of unexpected calm. The event is identical. The emotions are different, and the difference is entirely attributable to the thought that mediated between the event and the emotional response. This is not to say that you can think your way out of every difficult emotion. Some emotions arise from deep, valid, and important places. Grief, for instance, is not a thinking error. It is a natural response to loss. Fear in the presence of genuine danger is not a distortion. It is an appropriate alarm. But a great many of the emotions that cause daily suffering, the anxiety about things that have not happened, the resentment about things that may have been misinterpreted, the self-doubt based on beliefs that have never been examined, these emotions are fueled by thoughts that, when observed clearly, lose much of their power. The practice of observing your thoughts as they generate emotions is remarkably liberating. You begin to notice the speed with which the mind moves from event to interpretation to feeling. You begin to see the interpretive step, the thought that you were previously missing. And you begin to realize that many of your most intense emotional experiences are not responses to what is happening. They are responses to what you are telling yourself about what is happening. This realization does not eliminate the emotions, but it changes your relationship to them. You stop treating every emotion as an accurate readout of reality and start treating it as information that may or may not be reliable. You become, in a sense, a more discerning consumer of your own internal experience. There is a practical dimension to this that is worth exploring. When you feel a strong emotion arising, one that seems disproportionate to the situation or that is pushing you toward a response you suspect you may regret, try this. Pause. Notice the emotion without acting on it, and then ask yourself what thought is behind this feeling. What am I telling myself about this situation that is generating this response? Sometimes the thought will be obvious. You can see it clearly, and once you see it, you can evaluate it. Is it accurate? Is it helpful? Is it the only way to interpret the situation? Other times, the thought will be harder to identify. It may be a vague sense of being threatened or inadequate, a feeling without a clear narrative attached. In these cases, just the act of searching for the thought creates distance from the emotion. It engages the analytical part of your mind and reduces the grip of the reactive part. Over time, this practice changes not just individual emotional episodes, but the overall emotional climate of your inner life. You become less volatile, not because you have suppressed your emotions, but because you have become better at recognizing the thoughts that fuel them. You become calmer in situations that used to destabilize you, not because the situations have changed, but because your relationship to your own interpretation of those situations has changed. You respond to events rather than reacting to your stories about events. And that shift from reaction to response is one of the most significant changes a person can make. It is important to acknowledge that this is not easy. The speed and intensity of emotional reactions can be overwhelming. There will be times when the emotion arrives so fast and so powerfully that there is no space for observation. In those moments, the most useful thing you can do is observe after the fact. Once the intensity has passed, look back at what happened. What was the triggering event? What thought did your mind produce? What emotion followed? What did you do? This retrospective observation may not change what happened, but it builds the awareness that will help you catch the pattern earlier next time. Each time you observe a thought, emotion sequence, even after it has played out, you are training your mind to recognize the sequence, and recognition is the first step toward interruption. There is something deeply empowering about understanding that your emotional life is not simply something that happens to you. It is something you participate in, often unknowingly, through the thoughts you think and the stories you tell yourself. When you begin to observe this participation, you do not become emotionless. You become emotionally intelligent. You learn to feel deeply without being controlled by what you feel. You learn to experience the full range of human emotion without being swept away by it. And that is not a diminished life. It is a fuller one. Because when you are no longer afraid of your own emotions, when you know you can observe them and navigate them, you are free to engage with life more openly, more honestly, and more courageously. There is a dimension of this practice that goes beyond managing individual thoughts and emotions. It touches on something deeper, the very patterns of thinking that have shaped your mind over the course of your entire life. Everyone has mental patterns. They are the grooves that your thinking tends to follow, worn deep by years of repetition. Some people have a pattern of self-criticism that activates whenever they make a mistake. Some have a pattern of suspicion that activates whenever someone is kind to them. Some have a pattern of catastrophizing that activates whenever something uncertain looms. These patterns were not chosen. They were formed, usually in response to early experiences, relationships, and environments that taught the mind how the world works and what to expect from it. The important thing to understand about these patterns is that they are not permanent. They feel permanent because they are so deeply embedded that they seem like part of who you are. But they are not who you are. They are habits of thought. And like all habits, they can be changed. Not by forcing new thoughts into existence, which is exhausting and rarely effective, but by consistently observing the old thoughts when they arise. Observation weakens habitual patterns in the same way that sunlight weakens a photograph left on a windowsill. The process is gradual, often imperceptible day to day, but over time the image fades. Not because you attacked it, simply because you exposed it to something it was not designed to withstand. When you observe a recurring negative thought pattern, you are doing something subtle but profound. You are breaking the automaticity of the pattern. You are inserting consciousness into a process that previously ran entirely on autopilot. And each time you do this, the pattern loses a small fraction of its power. The thought still arises. The emotional echo still sounds. But the compulsion to obey, to act on the thought as though it were a command, diminishes. Over weeks and months of consistent practice, you begin to notice that thoughts which used to dominate your mind now pass through it with less friction. They still come, but they do not stay as long. They do not grip as tightly, and they do not dictate your behavior with the same authority. This is how mental patterns are rewritten. Not through dramatic epiphanies or sudden transformations, but through the steady, patient work of noticing. Each moment of awareness is like a drop of water on a stone. A single drop does nothing, but 10,000 drops begin to change the shape of the stone. And the person who practices observation consistently who returns to it again and again despite forgetting, despite failing, despite being swept away by old patterns more times than they can count, is the person who will eventually find that their mind has changed. Not because they forced it to change, but because they paid attention to it long enough for the change to occur naturally. This process works because the brain is not static. It is constantly reorganizing itself based on what it does and what it attends to. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections and weaken old ones in response to experience. When you repeatedly activate a particular thought pattern without observation, you strengthen it. The neural pathways associated with that pattern become more efficient, more automatic, more dominant. But when you observe the pattern without engaging with it, when you notice it and let it pass without following it into its usual cascade of emotion and action, you are, in effect, declining to strengthen it. And each time you decline, the pathway weakens slightly. Meanwhile, the new pathway, the pathway of awareness, of observation, of conscious choice, strengthens. Over time, the balance shifts. The old pattern does not disappear entirely. It may always be there, somewhere in the background, ready to activate under sufficient stress. But it loses its position of dominance. It becomes one option among many, rather than the only option available. This is the real power of the practice. It does not just help you manage individual thoughts or emotions. It gradually rewires the patterns that generate those thoughts and emotions in the first place. It changes the architecture of your inner life, and it does so not through force or suppression, but through the gentle, persistent light of awareness. There is a common misconception that changing mental patterns requires constant vigilance, that you must be on guard every moment, watching every thought, policing your own mind. This is not the case. In fact, that kind of hypervigilance is itself a form of stress that undermines the practice. The approach is gentler than that. It is more like gardening than warfare. You do not attack the weeds. You simply tend the garden consistently and patiently, trusting that over time the plants you want to grow will flourish and the ones you do not will recede. There will be days when the garden looks overgrown. There will be seasons when progress is hard to see. But if you keep showing up, keep tending, keep paying attention, the landscape of your mind will slowly, surely change. There is a word that often arises in conversations about this practice, and it is a word that is frequently misunderstood. That word is detachment. When people hear the word detachment, they often associate it with coldness, withdrawal, or emotional numbness. They imagine someone who is disconnected from life, floating above it in a state of indifference. But that is not what detachment means in this context. Detachment, as it applies to the observation of thoughts, means something very specific. It means not fusing with your thoughts. It means experiencing a thought without assuming it is true, without building your identity around it, and without allowing it to automatically dictate your behavior. Detachment does not mean you do not care. It means you care enough to respond wisely rather than react blindly. A surgeon who detaches from the emotional intensity of an operation in order to perform with precision is not indifferent to the patient's life. They are more engaged with it, not less, because their detachment allows them to bring their full skill and attention to the task without being overwhelmed by fear. A parent who detaches from the momentary anger triggered by a child's misbehavior in order to respond with patience and firmness is not cold. They are present. They are choosing their response rather than being carried by their reaction. Detachment, properly understood, is a form of profound engagement. It is the ability to be in a situation fully without being consumed by it. When you practice detachment from your thoughts, you discover something remarkable. You discover that you are not diminished by letting go of a thought. You are freed by it. When you stop clinging to the thought that you are not good enough, you do not become nothing. You become open to a more honest assessment of your abilities. When you stop clinging to the thought that a situation is hopeless, you do not become naive. You become available to see possibilities you were previously blind to. When you stop clinging to the thought that someone else is the cause of all your problems, you do not become a doormat. You become empowered to focus on what you can actually change. Detachment also brings clarity. When you are fused with your thoughts, your vision is narrow. You see only what the thought allows you to see. If the thought says this person is against me, you will notice every piece of evidence that supports that conclusion and ignore every piece that contradicts it. But when you step back from the thought, when you hold it at arm's length and examine it, rather than looking through it like a lens, your vision widens. You begin to see the full picture. You notice the contradictions. You see the nuance. And from that wider perspective, better decisions become available. One of the most practical applications of detachment is in the realm of self-image. Most people carry a set of deeply held beliefs about who they are. I am the kind of person who is shy. I am someone who is bad with money. I am not creative. I am not the type to take risks. These beliefs feel like facts, like descriptions of an unchangeable reality. But they are thoughts. They are stories that have been told and retold so many times that they have hardened into apparent truths. When you practice detaching from these thoughts, when you notice them arising and recognize them as patterns rather than facts, you create space for a different kind of self-understanding. You begin to see that you are not a fixed entity defined by a set of permanent characteristics. You are a dynamic, evolving being whose behaviors and capacities are influenced by many factors, including the thoughts you choose to engage with. This does not mean you can become anything just by thinking differently. There are real constraints on what any person can do. But within those constraints, there is usually far more room for growth and change than your habitual thoughts would have you believe. And detachment is what allows you to see that room. It is what allows you to hold your self-concept lightly, to update it as new evidence comes in, and to act from possibility rather than from a fixed and limiting narrative about who you are. Detachment is not something you achieve once and possess forever. It is something you practice, moment by moment, situation by situation. There will be thoughts you detach from easily, and thoughts that grip you with extraordinary force. There will be days when you move through your experience with remarkable awareness and days when you are swept away before you even notice what happened. This is not a failure of practice. This is the practice, the return to awareness, the moment of remembering that you can observe rather than be consumed, is itself the act of detachment. And every time you make that return, regardless of how long you were lost, you strengthen the capacity. If what we have been discussing sounds valuable in theory, the natural question is how it works in the texture of ordinary, daily life. How do you practice observation and detachment when you are not sitting quietly reflecting, but are in the middle of a conversation, a conflict, a stressful workday, or a difficult relationship? The answer is that these situations are not obstacles to the practice. They are the practice. They are where it matters most and where it has its greatest effect. Consider a conversation that begins to turn tense. Someone says something that triggers a defensive reaction in you. In the old pattern, the automatic pattern, you would react immediately. Your voice would change, your body would tense, you would say something sharp or withdraw into cold silence. But if you have been building the capacity for observation, something different can happen. You feel the reaction begin. You notice the heat rising, the thoughts forming, the impulse to defend or attack, and in that noticing, you create a moment of choice. You might still feel the anger. You might still disagree with what was said. But you have a moment, a fraction of a second, in which you can decide how to respond rather than being carried by the response that arises automatically. That moment is the fruit of practice. It does not appear on its own. It appears because you have trained yourself to be aware. Practicing during conversations requires a particular kind of attention. It requires listening not only to what the other person is saying, but also to what your own mind is saying in response. Most people, when they are in a conversation, are not truly listening. They are hearing the other person's words, while simultaneously formulating their own response, interpreting motives, predicting where the conversation is going, and reacting to their own internal narrative about the exchange. This internal commentary runs constantly, and it often distorts what is actually being communicated. When you practice observing this commentary, when you notice your mind generating judgments, assumptions, and reactions while someone else is speaking, you gain the ability to set those thoughts aside and actually listen. And genuine listening, listening without the filter of automatic interpretation, often changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. The other person feels heard, misunderstandings are reduced, and the exchange becomes more productive and more honest. Stressful situations provide another rich field for practice. When stress is high, automatic thinking intensifies. The mind races. Worst-case scenarios multiply. The urge to react, to do something, anything, to reduce the discomfort, becomes almost irresistible. But these are precisely the moments when observation is most valuable. When you can notice the stress response itself, when you can observe the racing thoughts and the physical tension and the urge to react without being swept into immediate action, you create space for a more considered response. The stress does not disappear, but it no longer makes your decisions for you. You can feel the urgency and still choose to pause. You can notice the catastrophic thoughts and still choose to take a more measured assessment of the situation. You can experience the physical discomfort and still choose to respond from clarity rather than from panic. Daily routines offer perhaps the most accessible opportunity for practice. Most of your day is spent in activities that do not require your full conscious attention. Activities like commuting, eating, showering, walking, doing household tasks. During these activities, the mind typically wanders into its default mode of thinking about the past or the future, planning, worrying, fantasizing, rehashing. These are the moments when you can practice observing, not suppressing the wandering thoughts, not judging yourself for having them, but simply noticing that your mind has drifted to a worry about work, noticing that it is replaying a conversation from yesterday, noticing that it is constructing a scenario about something that might happen tomorrow. Each time you notice, you are practicing awareness, and each moment of awareness, however brief, strengthens the capacity that makes the more demanding applications of the practice possible. There is also value in practicing observation during positive experiences. Most people think of this practice as something you do when things are difficult. But observing your thoughts during pleasant moments can be equally instructive. You might notice that your mind has difficulty staying present even during enjoyable experiences. You might notice it comparing the current experience to a past one, or worrying that the good feeling will not last, or planning the next thing before the current thing is even finished. Observing these patterns during pleasant moments builds the same awareness muscle and often deepens the capacity to actually enjoy what is happening. When you can be present to a moment of genuine pleasure without your mind immediately pulling you elsewhere, the quality of your experience changes. It becomes richer, more vivid, more fully felt. The key to all of this is consistency rather than intensity. A few moments of awareness practiced regularly will produce more change than an occasional marathon of concentrated effort. This is because the practice works through repetition. Through the steady accumulation of moments in which you notice what your mind is doing and choose your response consciously. Each moment is small, each moment is modest, but together they form something substantial. They form a mind that is less reactive, more aware, more capable of navigating the complexity of human life with clarity and intention. Let us return now to Julian, the man who was carried away by a single thought about being disrespected in a meeting. When we left him, he was caught in a cycle of rumination, defensiveness, and growing anxiety. His marriage was strained. His sleep was disrupted. His work performance was declining. And he was entirely unaware that the source of his suffering was not his boss's comment, but his own unexamined response to it. The shift began, as these shifts often do. Not with a book or a technique, but with a moment of exhaustion so complete that something had to give. Julian was sitting in his car, in the parking lot of his office, unable to bring himself to go inside. He had been sitting there for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the building, feeling a mixture of dread and resentment that had become so familiar it felt like his natural state. And in that moment, for reasons he could not fully explain, he became aware of his own thinking. Not the content of the thoughts, which he knew all too well, but the process itself. He noticed, as if for the first time, that his mind was doing something. It was generating a narrative, a story about what was happening, what it meant, and what would happen next. And the narrative was not neutral. It was dark, threatening, and absolute. It spoke with the authority of fact. And yet, sitting there in the quiet of his car, Julian had a fleeting realization that startled him. The narrative might be wrong. He did not know what to do with that realization. It was too new, too fragile, too contrary to everything his mind had been insisting on for weeks. But it stayed with him. And over the following days, he began to experiment, cautiously and without any clear method, with simply watching his thoughts instead of following them. When the thought "he does not respect me" arose, Julian tried something new. Instead of building a case to support the thought, he simply noticed it. "There is that thought again," he said to himself. He did not argue with it. He did not try to replace it with something positive. He just acknowledged it and let it be. And something subtle happened. The intensity of the emotion behind the thought decreased. Not dramatically, not all at once, but noticeably. The thought was still there, but it had loosened its grip just slightly. Julian began to apply this approach more deliberately. In meetings, when he felt the familiar surge of defensiveness, he would notice it. He would feel the heat in his face and the tightness in his chest, and instead of launching into a defensive response, he would take a breath and observe what his mind was doing. He began to see the pattern with increasing clarity. A comment was made. His mind interpreted it as a threat. Emotion surged. The urge to react appeared. And there, in the narrow space between the urge and the action, he found a moment where he could choose. He did not always choose well. Sometimes the old pattern was too fast, too strong, and he reacted before he could catch himself. But the proportion began to shift. More moments of awareness, fewer moments of automatic reaction. His colleagues noticed the change before he fully understood it himself. He was calmer in meetings. He was more open to feedback. He was less defensive, less brittle, more present. His relationship with the division head did not become warm, but it normalized. The charged, adversarial quality that had existed primarily in Julian's interpretation began to dissolve as the interpretation was seen for what it was. At home, the changes were even more significant. Julian began to notice how his thoughts about work were spilling into his interactions with his family. He could see the moment when a work-related thought would trigger irritation, and instead of directing that irritation at his wife or children, he would pause. He would acknowledge to himself that the feeling was not about them. It was about a thought. And that simple acknowledgement allowed him to set it aside and be present in his own home. Julian would not describe what happened to him as a transformation. He would describe it as a waking up. He had been asleep to his own mind, reacting to every thought as though it were a command, living inside a narrative he had never questioned. And when he began to wake up, when he began to observe the thoughts rather than obey them, his experience of life changed. Not because the world changed, but because his relationship to his own thinking changed. And that was enough. As we come to the end of this time together, I want to leave you with something to carry forward. Not a technique, exactly, though we have explored many. Not a theory, though we have looked at how the mind works in detail. What I want to leave you with is a recognition that may already be forming in you, or that may take days or weeks to fully settle in. You are not every thought that crosses your mind. That sentence is easy to say and extraordinarily difficult to fully absorb, because the identification with thought is so deep, so pervasive, so woven into the fabric of your daily experience that it feels inseparable from who you are. But it is not. You are not your anxious thoughts. You are not your self-critical thoughts. You are not your angry thoughts, your jealous thoughts, your fearful thoughts, or your despairing thoughts. You are the awareness in which all of those thoughts arise. You are the space in which the voice speaks. You are the listener, not the voice. And the moment you begin to recognize this, something shifts, not all at once, not in a blinding flash, but steadily, quietly, and irreversibly. This recognition does not solve all of your problems. It does not make you immune to suffering. It does not eliminate anxiety, sadness, anger, or any of the other difficult emotions that are part of being human. But it changes your relationship to these experiences in a way that makes them more navigable. When you know that a thought is a thought and not a command, you can choose whether to follow it. When you know that an emotion is a response to an interpretation and not an inevitable reaction to reality, you can question the interpretation. When you know that you are the observer and not the observed, you can face, even the most difficult inner experiences, with a kind of steady presence that would have seemed impossible when you were lost inside them. The practice is simple, but it asks something real of you. It asks for your attention, not your effort, not your force, not your willpower, but your attention. The willingness to notice what is happening inside your mind again and again, without judgment, without expectation, without the need for immediate results. Each moment of noticing is complete in itself. It does not need to lead anywhere. It does not need to produce a breakthrough. It simply needs to happen. And when it does, something accumulates. An awareness that becomes more stable, more available, more naturally present over time. An awareness that is, in the most practical sense, the foundation of every wise decision, every calm response, and every moment of genuine clarity you will ever experience. True control of the mind does not come from force. You cannot wrestle your thoughts into submission. You cannot suppress your way to peace. You cannot think your way out of thinking. But you can become aware. You can learn to watch. You can discover, through direct experience, that the thoughts which seem so powerful, so urgent, so absolutely true, are events passing through a field of awareness that is far wider, far deeper, and far more stable than anything the thoughts themselves could ever contain. That awareness is always there. It has always been there. It does not need to be created. It only needs to be noticed. And the noticing is something you can begin right now, in this moment, with this breath, with this thought. You are listening to a voice that has been speaking for a very long time. The voice in your head, the voice that tells you who you are, what to fear, what to want, what to believe. Now you know that you do not have to believe everything it says. Now you know that you can listen without obeying. Now you know that between the thought and the reaction, there is a space. And in that space, you are free.